In higher ed, we're all looking for big wins, but reducing a 75% application abandonment rate and achieving a 90% conversion rate, that's next level transformation. Michael Battersworth, CMO at Texas State Technical College, shares how they achieved this by streamlining the application process with Element 451.
Our Element journey began out of a necessity. We were switching to a new SIS, and the application process was going to pose some real usability issues for us. We felt that application was going to hamper our enrollment. So we began quickly to evaluate different CRMs, different applications. So for context on that, our conversion rate with the prior application had about 75% abandonment of people clicking apply to submit. And the first weeks after going live with Element, we saw an 80% conversion, and that's now up to 90. So improving the usability of that application on the front end process has had a significant advance in our intake.
When technology works for students, it works for you. Visit element451.com to see how simplifying the application process with artificial intelligence will lead to significant results for your institution. Welcome to the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, where each week we explore the impact of EdTech on the student experience with engaging, fun, and relevant conversations that honor the wide range of work happening all across the higher ed ecosystem. I'm your host, Dustin Ramsdell. I've been working in and around higher ed for the past decade, focused on student support and digital experiences. Join me every week for discussions with some of the best minds in education technology. The Higher Ed Geek Podcast is a part of the Enrollify podcast network, a robust collection of shows designed to help higher education professionals like you grow. Explore our other shows at enrollify.org or check out some of my personal favorites linked in the show notes below. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the leading AI-powered all-in-one student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful, personalized, and engaging interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com. Hey there, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, episode number 269 with Dr. Keith Edwards, talking transformative leadership in higher education. Really big topic, but a really important one as the whole sector is navigating quite a bit of turbulence. It has continued for quite some time. Does not look to be letting up. If not, it's intensifying. So, just really appreciate Keith's really thoughtful approach, all of his knowledge and wisdom and great quotes and things, and just kind of really explaining the imperative that leaders need to meet this moment with of, transformative leadership, the inner work, and how are they going to galvanize their teams to innovate their institutions and just kind of survive and thrive as we just kind of keep on keeping on into the future here, continue to recruit and support and graduate students. So just was really excited to get Keith on, his fellow podcaster, Student Affairs Now, his podcast, go check it out. But just really appreciate Keith's time here and all that he shared. So please do enjoy this awesome episode of the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, episode number 269 with Dr. Keith Edwards.
I'm Keith Edwards, and I'm a speaker, author, and coach. I've spent 25 years working in higher education, most of that in campus-based roles. The past almost 10 years, I've been working on my own. And I describe my work as empowering better tomorrows. And I do that through focus on leadership, learning, and equity. A couple of real concrete things I do. I work with a lot of college campuses and moving into corporate and nonprofit realms around learning and development with curricular approaches and really being intentional and aligned and integrated with for higher ed, for learning beyond the classroom. And in corporate realms around leadership development, learning development, employee engagement, things like that. One of the things I think is going to come up in our conversation today is this Evolve program that I do with my colleagues Brian Arau and Don Lee. This is really for senior leaders around transformative leadership, around issues of equity. We do that for leaders and for leadership teams. And then related, I work with nonprofit leaders around strategic planning and staff retreats and board retreats, things like that. And then, of course, as you know, Dustin, I am one of the co-hosts for Student Affairs Now, which is another podcast that really focuses on student affairs in higher education. We've been doing that for more than 4 years now, which is a little unbelievable to say. And, coming up on 250 episodes and just great conversations and good social listening and paying attention. And it's been really great. So I'm happy to be here and talk with you today.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here. And what kind of inspired me to reach out at this particular time to talk to you about this particular topic, you had sort of a similar conversation on Student Affairs Now, talking about presidential leadership and sort of, navigating this moment and everything. And I kind of wanted to, which I feel like anymore is sometimes where it's like I'll be reading something or doing something else, and it's like I want somebody to like really process this with, but also like, anymore it's like I don't want to hog it all for myself. Like I want to, share this out and make it available to others, because I think this is such an important conversation at this moment is for higher ed. How are we sort of navigating these turbulent times with a sort of like transformative leadership kind of mindset or point of view, and trying to kind of acknowledge the challenges, the ambiguity, all those sort of things, but look at kind of the opportunities and everything that are out there as well, try to find what are sort of the ways forward and everything. So I'm curious from your perspective, I guess as succinctly as you can put it, to kind of start off our conversation here, what does transformative leadership look like to you right now?
Well, I appreciate you mentioning that conversation, Presidential Competencies, with Kevin McClure and Jorge Bermicki, who interviewed, hundreds of leaders. And what I really loved about the report that they did is it's the closest thing I've seen around the presidency that aligns with conversations I'm having with presidents and people in senior leadership roles. They're not talking about free speech. They're not talking about enrollment cliffs. They're not talking about the financial model, although those are very real challenges they're facing. They're talking about, how do I get up every day and keep doing this? How do I listen to people who are in so much pain over and over and over again? How do I take criticism from my friends? And their piece really outlines these skills around communication and using data and resilience and emotional intelligence. And it really reflects the conversations I have. So I get to have conversations with higher ed leaders through the podcast, Student Affairs Now. I also coach senior leaders, college presidents and senior leaders. And that gives me sort of a behind the scenes footage to what they're really thinking, what they're really wrestling with, because it's not public. It's not in a group setting. It's entirely confidential. And so they share what is really frustrating and really working with them. And I think the things that I learned there is the pace of change is just on this escalating curve, right? Like people who said, going into COVID or going into a new administration, like, we'll weather the storm and wait till it goes back to normal. Like that's not happening, right? The pace of change is there. And we use terms like VUCA for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And the level of that VUCA is just going to keep going up. The pace of change around AI is just going to get faster and faster. Climate change. We do have enrollment cliffs and challenge to the model, governmental unpredictability, demographic shifts and changes. And many of the leaders in higher ed are facing succession challenges, right? The senior leaders are going to be leaving, and there's not like a bench behind them. So are we going to keep them on into their 70s? Or are we going to bring in people who move them up a couple leaders? So I think there's just so many challenges right now. And transactional leadership says, well, we're losing a vice chancellor. Let's find a new one who's a lot like that person. Transactional leadership says, our expenses went up 3%. How do we manage tuition and fees to go up 1.5% and still make that work? And these are largely the problems that we face and the challenges we take on if we look at a day-to-day kind of thing. When we zoom back out, though, those are not going to solve our problems in the long run. We need to shift from transactional to transformational. And I think that the time is certainly here for higher ed to really rethink our approach in so many different ways, as we shifted from information and knowledge being a real tool. And then Google came along and said, well, we can tell you anything, right? And then it became about intelligence. And now AI is coming along and saying, well, we can help you sort through these things, maybe accurately, maybe inaccurately. And I think now is really a time for wisdom and humanity and understanding and things like that to be a part of it. So there's so much going on. And I think leaders who are just trying to keep up or be a little less behind are playing an old game. I think the new game is this transformational leadership. How do we really rethink this whole enterprise? And that might be your financial aid system. It might be your entire institution. It might be for some folks listening, how do we change the system of higher education across 23 different institutions in our state? Because the old model isn't really working. And I think we see that around the enrollment cliff, dual enrollment, staffing. I mean, when you talk with these senior higher ed leaders, they are just panicky about the people they are losing and how do we replace them, at every single level. So I think there's just so much, and the old solutions and the old knowledge, and I got my PhD in higher education administration in 2007, and I love my program, I love my faculty, I love my fellow students, I loved what I read, and pretty much none of it is still relevant. But the skill of learning, being present, being engaged, being innovative and creative, that still serves me every single day over and over again. And so I think that's a bit about what we're talking about. Are we going to just incrementally adjust to these new realities, or are we going to be willing to examine fundamental shifts? Now, fundamental shifts aren't always good, but I see so many higher ed leaders who are unwilling to even consider fundamental shifts because it makes them uncomfortable. Maybe other people know more than they are. They're not in the realm of expertise. They don't know everything. And I think our need to be certain and know everything and never make a mistake and always be right is a real obstacle to good leadership.
Yeah, I appreciate you kind of setting the stage there. And I mean, certainly the juxtaposition between transactional leadership and transformation, kind of transformative leadership, of like that idea of transformative, so much of it more being just around like humanity and sort of like these sort of like evergreen concepts or sort of traits and characteristics and those sort of things that are like always going to be valuable. And that idea of like part of the kind of challenge there, just especially from what I'm hearing, is that idea of like, you do have to ground that at least in kind of like the acknowledgement of the reality that we live in today kind of thing. Like, you don't want to just be like, oh, we're just sort of like, lofty and sort of aloof and doing whatever. Cause that almost is sometimes like, and that's kind of my follow-up here, like my next question of like, for higher ed specifically, like why is this sort of shift so important? Because I think it is like what you're saying, where like, oh, it'll all work out in the end. We just have to like get through it or whatever else. Like, so like that idea that higher ed, I've heard this refrain in different contexts and conversations about like, why is higher ed struggling so much, is that top leadership will sometimes be like not willing to get into the details to figure out like how do they transform themselves and whatever, because it's just like, oh, it does always just seem to work out, or, I guess we'll figure it out, at some point in the future, whatever. It's like, oh, I think we should try to figure it out now when we're not in a mode of like desperation or like, survival mode and everything. And I think it has been that wake up call when we've seen, so many institutions closing and everything. Like it is the idea where it's like, okay, it's hard to refute that we're in maybe a different moment now than we had been in maybe, moments prior, or maybe there was some sort of existential crisis about like, what is higher ed? And like, who are we, whatever. So if you can clarify, I guess, a little bit more of like, why do you feel like this moment is so important for higher ed, that idea of like the need to shift more from transactional to transformative leadership?
Yeah. Well, I just think the challenges facing us are increasing, and they're quantitatively and qualitatively different. I think one of the things that we've been able to do in higher ed, the major challenge, I think, has been a financial model where costs go up and we try and keep pace with tuition and fees at a lower level. Healthcare costs, building costs, energy costs, mostly people costs, just going up at 8 to 10 to 12%, while we try and keep tuition and fees going up at 1.5%, 2.5%, whatever we can get away with. But now we're seeing, and the primary way we've done is just admit more students, right? And then we can do that. With an enrollment cliff coming and just not this ever increasing group of potential students, it really challenges that. And I think the shift that I anticipate seeing, I don't know that I'm seeing this quite yet, but I anticipate it, is when there was just more students out there, you could admit the strategy was, let's keep up with the Joneses. We are an institution just like all those other institutions you're looking at. We have every major that they have. We have every student group that they have. We have every activity we have. We are just like whoever you might also be considering. And I get that. When there's just a ton of students out there, you can do that. But I think when there are fewer potential students, fewer customers, the strategy will shift to we're just like everybody else to here's how we're different. We have an enormous esports program, and that may or may not be for you. But if it is, we're a great place for you to be. We are a small liberal arts college in the middle of a major metropolitan city. And you may or may not be interested in that. But if that is appealing to you, we are the place for you. We have an incredible focus on nursing and health sciences. And that's kind of what we've organized everything around. Now, if that's not for you, you should go somewhere else. But if it is, I think that's the kind of thing that will happen. And that might be programs, that might be place, that might be a Jesuit institutional history, that might be 4-year live-on requirement, that might be whatever. But I think keeping up with everybody else isn't going to shift. So I think that's a big thing. But you're pointing to one of the things that I think is really fundamental. I think one of the things is that transformative leadership is really about change, really about broad social change, maybe institutional change, maybe cultural change. And people listening to this might be thinking about the department they lead. They might be thinking about an entire institution they lead, or they might be thinking about the US or the world that they want to change. And I'm constantly reminded that when I think about change work or social change work, I'm super tempted to think about changing other people. Like I want to change your mind, Dustin. I want to change the institutional policies. I want to change the legislature. I want to change public opinion. But all meaningful change work begins with inner work. It begins with what's going on inside me so that we can be engaged in the right ways, not doing harm, be sustainable, be present with other people. Some of those things that those presidential competencies get at. And I think one of the things that undermines us in our inner work is confusing what I would describe as optimism and positivity and hope. And I think what I heard you describing was a bit of positivity, which is everything's going to be fine, everything's great. And I get why leaders are tempted to that when things are hard, but it turns into toxic positivity. Like we're just going to pretend in spite of all of this and all of this and all of this that everything's going to be fine. And that is actually a really terrible psychological strategy. Pretending that things are good when they're bad is really terrible. Sometimes we then shift into optimistic. Yes, things are challenging, but it will all work out in the end, which is just kind of a fatalist. Like, yeah, hands off the wheel. We don't have to take responsibility. Everything's going to work out. I just believe that that's true. And it's sort of a positive way to justify our disengagement and why we're not making hard decisions and we're not making tough calls. So I much prefer this notion rather than positive or optimistic of hope. And I resonate with a few different versions of hope, which Shane Lopez, who passed away from cancer, but wrote a great book on hope, defined hope as tomorrow can be better than today, and I have a role in making that happen. And so that possibility, things can get better, and I have agency. So what am I going to do? Not that it's all on me, but like, what am I going to do? What role am I going to play? What am I going to do? I think shifts us out of that, what you were sort of describing, what I would call toxic positivity or Pollyanna or naive. And I think that's a really important thing. And, for me, some days are hard to cultivate that hope. And I think about hope like I think about gratitude, not an emotion we await, but something that we practice. And so how could tomorrow be better than today? What role can I play in doing that? Because there's a lot of things that I'd like to be better that no one cares. And I spend a lot of time writing those tweets in my head. And I know no one will read them and no one will care and it won't matter. And it'll just take a lot of my day and a lot of my energy. And I can feel outraged and that might make me feel better, but it's not going to contribute to the change that I want to do. So what is the way that I can play a role? And I think you talked about accepting and reality. And I think psychologist and mindfulness teacher Tara Brach talks about radical acceptance. And the first step in radical acceptance is accepting what is happening. It's accepting reality and not arguing with reality. That doesn't mean you like it or you approve or it's morally good, but you're just like, I'm here in Minnesota. It's 2 degrees outside right now. Now I can wish it was 72. I can complain about it being 2 degrees, or I can say it's 2 degrees. Going to wear a hat and a jacket and the big gloves today, right? Like I need to accept what is real so that I can engage with it. And I think many of us can get caught in arguing with reality, which feels super productive and you get a lot of points for, but it's not leadership. It's not taking responsibility. It's not engaging, right? And so it can be a real sophisticated, tantalizing way to justify our disengagement.
Yeah, it's really powerful stuff. And I think it's so interesting because this is such a
Because I think I always joke about how higher ed, I feel like, is so prone to like existential crises for one reason or another, whether it's like AI or the pandemic or whatever, like, TikTok even or something, But that idea is like, again, I guess to just lean into that, is that idea is like, if you've been worshiping at the altar of like, toxic positivity, like that's been my engine, that's been driving me, but then it fails you. You're just sort of like, the well has dried up. Like, what do I do? Whatever. And it's like, well, if you can accept the reality of this moment and start to harness the potential of like hope and your agency and everything else, it's like you can maybe prevent sort of the desperation or survival instinct or, having to make these like really harsh or abrupt decisions or cuts or whatever else. Yeah, I think that's the idea, is that like that's been unfortunately a too common story for higher ed in particular. And I think other organizations, have maybe had similar stories, but I think it's been maybe a bit kind of exaggerated, unfortunately, in higher ed. But the other thing, I guess, what popped in my head, I don't want to lose it, is like the idea of kind of with what you're sort of laying out on the sort of spectrum of like the positivity and everything else, is like that institutions will then overly lean on one positive metric. Like they'll say like, oh, we had increased applications this year. But it's like, well, that doesn't say how many students actually enrolled. But then even if they actually enrolled, how many students stuck around or even graduated? Like, because obviously that's just always going to be like a diminishing return. If it's like, sure, a lot of people applied because you kind of, game the system to kind of put yourself out there and be like maybe really accessible in that way. And, you're waiving all these app fees or whatever else. And then you're like, we're getting all these applications, like, good days are right around the corner or whatever. Like, that's just something else that popped in my head. And some people have been calling that out, is that like, there are publicly available metrics where you can see like graduation rates and different things, and you can kind of instantly interrogate like these press releases and stuff that some institution will put out there. And it's like, I think that sometimes is that good example of like, clearly their leadership is maybe being a little like, Pollyanna about things or whatever, where there's like, everything's going to be great. Everything's fine. Look at all these applications that we got. And like, they're not, because I think, again, it is that idea of you can transform and sort of transcend and kind of get above the fray of the transactional things of just like, oh, we have, like you're saying, increased costs. We, do whatever, tuition fee adjustments to kind of level set that. And you're like kicking the can down the road of like the necessity of making decisions that will maybe be like, we're never going to have to be in a position to grapple with these sort of like minutia of dollars and cents ever again. Like it's going to be something like we're going to be able to transform into like you're saying, like a differentiated, unique, value proposition to students, and we'll be able to really lean into that, tell that story better, and all those sort of different things. But
one of the things that I'm often reminding the senior leaders in higher ed that I'm coaching, whether that's one-on-one or when I'm working with teams, senior leadership teams, I'm reminding them that every leader wants to be trusted. And the way the culture has taught us to build trust is to know everything, have the answer, be certain, never make a mistake. And when we do that, people don't trust us. I mean, it's like, what are you hiding? It's inauthentic. It feels like toxic positivity. It feels Pollyanna. It feels like you're trying to pull something over on me. And this is where the inner work comes in, is how can we as leaders say, I don't know how we're going to navigate this challenge, right? As a small regional institution, how are we going to navigate having far fewer potential students? But I think a senior leader who feels like I have to know how to solve that and tell everybody how they're going to solve it and make them do it is just such an outdated model, right? Like we have these institutions of higher education filled with experts from psychology, from finance, from economics, from all of these different things, plus all the expertise and people who are actually trained around leading higher education. Why don't we say, here are the challenges, here are the problems. Love to hear from you what possibilities you see. I'm going to do these series of listening conversations. Here's a form where you can submit them and take that stuff seriously. One of the things that Kevin McClure and Jorge Bermicki talked about in that conversation was good listening skills, but systemic listening. How do I listen to an organization of 15,000 people, right? It's not one-on-one like we're doing, right? But how do I pay attention, and how do I notice in social media and this campus paper and faculty senate and these forums and these things, and create a forum where people can submit that and take that stuff seriously and then share back with people that we're taking things seriously. We all want to be trusted as leaders. The myth is Know everything and never make a mistake is how you'll do that. And many leaders are trying that strategy. The reality is, as Brene Brown would tell us, if you want people to trust you, be vulnerable. Share when you made a mistake. Share what you don't know. Share your fears. Share where you need help. And when leaders do that, we trust them. And for I think everybody knows this when they're being led. And then when we are in the position of leader, I got to know everything and never make a mistake and have every answer and have everything. And I think it's a real shift for us as we move from that, some of that inner work, which is a lot of the work that I do, into some of the vision and the strategy and the execution. One of my favorite quotes these days is from Nelson Mandela, who said, "Vision without action is just a dream. Action without vision just passes the time. And vision with action can change the world." And that sounds so familiar. I mean, how many of us have been in that vision without action is just a dream? It looks like a 2-day mission, vision, values retreat that we never talk about again, right? We've done that. Or action without vision, right? Like, I'm super busy. I have no idea why or what the purpose is or what the grand vision is. And that's troubling. It's often a waste of our time, and we can't improvise because we don't understand the purpose. But when you have purpose aligned with our day-to-day, that can be really powerful. And I think it calls us to not just be focused on what we're against, but be focused on what are we for and what do we want. Not just this is a problem and this is a crisis and this is terrible and I can't believe this. We need to be clear about those realities. But what we're looking for is this, right? So instead of focusing on every student who isn't retained, what's our retention level we'd like to get to? What is helping students? What is making a difference? How can we pay attention to that? Rather than focusing on the access and equity obstacles, which we need to be clear about, we need to understand. But the goal isn't to point out all the obstacles. The goal is actual access and belonging and liberation and freedom and fairness for everybody. So how do we take our knowledge and understanding of the challenges and the problems and the structures and the systems and be very clear about that? And then what is it that we want to create that would be better for us all? And that pulls me into emergent strategy and Adrienne and Marie Brown and some other things. And maybe we should move into some of these 7 practices for better tomorrows that we maybe talked about.
Yeah. And I mean, I just appreciate, obviously, you're such a kind of rich resource of great quotes and insights here and everything. But I think, I mean, there's so much there, I guess, that I'm reflecting on is that idea of like you're saying, like vision without action or vice versa and all those things where like, to me, like it reminded me where like, I think as like a relatively new parent, just like an example of sort of that notion is like, as parents, sometimes people are like doing stuff where like I'm looking at it as like, you're doing that just for you. Like, you're not actually doing that for your kid. And like, that's the idea where like, if you're doing like vision without action, it's like, okay, you just want to like pat yourself on the back, like, we made this great vision, like, and I'm doing a great job or whatever, and you're not actually doing it for your team or your people. But then also that idea of, okay, well, here's all the things of like why students aren't retaining or whatever. And you could just like create this laundry list of problems. And it's just sort of like the negativity bias sort of like run amok, because then it's just like, cool, now you've just overwhelmed your entire team of just like all these things I guess we have to solve versus like, well, that is productive to a point. But how about we also say like, well, what is working and what can we like kind of juice up a little bit more? But it's just like, wow, tutoring has been super impactful. Like, and I think everybody would agree that that typically has been the case. It's like, how can we make more tutoring available to more students or, whatever else kind of thing. So like, trying to find that right balance again, because you don't want to be completely ignoring problems, but you want to be sort of level setting and kind of right sizing, like where you're putting your focus or emphasis or resources or stuff like that, I guess is where sort of my mind's going.
Yeah. And for me, it's a both and, right? We need to clearly understand the challenges and the problems that we face, and we need to have a vision for what we want to create. This brings us back to Adrienne Marie Brown and emergent strategy, talking about you can't move toward what you can't envision. And she particular is focused on a lot of African-American centric fiction because it creates possibilities and imaginations. And that's what a whole emergent strategy is about. I really think for folks who aren't familiar with Adrienne Marie Brown, I think in 40 years, we'll look back on her as one of the great thinkers of our time. Like we think of Bell Hooks or Maya Angelou or Grace Lee Boggs now. I think she's on lots of podcasts and it's always good, good for the soul. But what is it that we want to create? What is it that we want to move forward? And it's not either or, right? It's a both and, right? And I think Parenting is always a good example. As someone a little further down that path, like you've got to you never know what you're doing. As soon as you do, your kids change and they don't do that thing anymore. And you're always in the space of unknowing. And that's the space of transformational leadership. How do I navigate this new realm and be with what is and not argue with reality? This is how my kid's feeling. This is what my kid's doing. This is the challenges my kid's facing. Be with that reality. And then what would we like to see here? Well, this is an opportunity to teach kindness, or this is an opportunity to teach resilience. This is an opportunity for them to figure it out for themselves. How do we navigate that? And that answer is different, right? And I think sometimes we think there's a single leadership answer. I'm working with a lot of leaders now on navigating change and resistance from their teams. And we talk about resistance as though it's one thing, when in reality, it's a dozen different things. And if someone's just being petty and someone is confused, and we label that both one thing and respond with one way, we're not providing good leadership. And so how do we say, oh, I see you need to be held accountable and you need to learn and maybe to have your hand held through the process so you can really get it and move on from there. But if we just do our favorite sort of response, it's not going to lead to kind of the outcomes that we want. And that's the nuance of leadership. And you always know you got it wrong after the fact. Usually when you get it right, you're never quite sure, but after the fact, oh, I used accountability when they need grace. I messed that up. Or I offered grace and now I see a year later, it really should have been accountability. But that's the challenge and the nature and the difficulty of leadership.
Before I guess we get too far away, like I think just all these dynamics and all these things that we're sort of laying out here, I feel like you may be a very neutral perspective on this. Obviously, we talk a lot about like digital transformation, AI on this show. I'm curious if, you can give sort of just a brief sort of snapshot of your point of view of like how those things are playing into sort of like, the issues or, because you mentioned sort of that idea of like social media can be an outlet where a leader can be doing that sort of like kind of collective listening and everything. So like, I imagine these can be tools, but they can also be barriers. Maybe they're accelerants of like trends and things that are forcing leaders to maybe need to act in a more transformative way. So I guess like just any sort of perspectives from your point of view on how digital transformation, and or AI, kind of whatever I guess is salient to you of like, how are they playing into this moment and what hired leaders are sort of confronting and how they're needing to kind of determine their strategy?
Yeah, I think I'm often reminded that binary solutions are often dominator thinking. That's something I learned from bell hooks and my friend and colleague Rachel Wagner, who often reminds me of that, or I hear her in my head reminding me of bell hooks saying that. And so I'm always cautious of AI is good or bad, social media is good or bad. I think we need to think more carefully and more nuanced about these things. And I think it's about context. I think it's about the person. I certainly know lots of people who don't want to have anything to do with AI because they're concerned about how much water and resources it consumes and the impact on the climate. And it's being used based on oppressive systems and structures, and they don't want to replicate that. And it's creating those in the way it provides biased information. I get and I understand all of that. I also think it's quite an incredible tool that can be used for good and for understanding in the right ways. And so how do we engage with that? I would say the same thing about any digital transformation, whether that's AI, whether that's common apps, whether that's digital tools. I mean, how many of our campuses are committed to dozens and dozens of external vendors to provide us critical services? Does that mean those are bad? I don't think so. Does that mean they're always a good idea? I definitely don't think so. And so what's right for this institution at this moment in time? What's the right tool? What's the right strategy? And I think we can think about that institutionally. We can think about that organizationally. We can also just think about that for ourselves. Like, at what point is being on social media a really useful tool? But I'm not going to post. I'm just going to listen and pay attention and do things in this way. Or I'm only going to post and I'm not going to listen and I'm not going to consume, right? And I think the if our answers are yes or no, good, bad, either or, I think that's simple thinking and it won't serve us. If our answers are in the both and, all right, for me in this context, in this situation, and always being able to reevaluate that and move forward, I think we're more engaged in the conversation. I think one of those most powerful things I ever learned in my life was a reframing of a Buddhist teaching. And I say it as life gets magical if you can let go of control over everything that is beyond you and at the same time claim more agency over everything that is within you. So life gets magical if you can let go of control over everything that is beyond you and simultaneously claim more agency for everything that is within you. I can't control the weather or the news or your chancellor or the applications. So how do I let go of that? And how do I put control over my agency, which is what am I going to think about that? What am I going to learn about that? What am I going to bring up at the next meeting? How am I going to engage with my constituencies? How do we want to frame the questions on this broad listening tool? How are we going to share back out what we're hearing from people so they not only feel like they got to submit something, but they actually were heard and we're making these changes as a result of that. So that control over beyond you and agency within you, I think, is a pretty fundamental shift that opens up a lot of possibility, space. It opens up a lot of energy. And it's a great reminder for me pretty much constantly of all the things that are beyond my control that I'm spending a lot of time and energy trying to control.
Well, I think that's like that wisdom piece of like the application of it, of like the discernment of evaluating these tools, how and when are they used? It's not just sort of like we're never using it or we're going to use it and use it all the time and there's no problems ever with, and I think it could even be that idea of if you're saying like, okay, well, we're like holding off on AI and these are our reasons why, like we can give the context for it. And I think as things develop and change, we allow ourselves the like kind of opportunity to change our minds or reevaluate our decisions. And so, like, that sort of stuff is very powerful and being transparent, giving context, and even that idea of like human beings change their minds all the time. So like, even as a leader, again, like don't be limiting yourself in that sort of idea of like perfection, meaning that you're like static or something, the idea of like, well, I achieved it and I have to keep doing this forever because like, I achieved this, abstract idea of like perfection or whatever.
Yeah. I think that's such a great example. You mentioned the perfectionism, which is such an insidious thing that leads us to feel like we have to know everything, be certain, never make a mistake, and then we cover up things. And changing our mind is a really incredible way to gain that trust through vulnerability. When I work with leaders and I talk about this notion of trust and vulnerability, and often the senior leader in the room will say, how do I do that? I said, it's so easy. The next time you make a mistake, just make a really big deal about it. And they're like, I don't want to do that. I'm like, how often do you make a mistake? They're like, well, all the time, but I don't want to make a big deal about it. I prefer it went unnoticed. And I say, well, here's the thing. The next time you make a mistake, you just say at the staff, I made a mistake. I'm so sorry. I was trying to do this. It actually turned into this. I apologize. Here's what I learned from it. And what you're doing from the safety of your positional leadership is you're modeling risk-taking, making mistakes, taking responsibility, taking ownership, learning from it, improving. And, right underneath that, I would say, change your mind. Say, I used to say this, and now I don't think so anymore. Now I believe this. I used to think this was the right path forward for us, and it was for lots of good thinking and good reasons. I've changed my mind, and now I think this is the best way forward. And being explicit about that, people go, oh, well, this person is really alive and present with what's happening and not locked into past thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. And I think I will give you the opportunity, I think, is maybe sort of like synthesizing, summarizing, bring it all home here with our final question and everything, and however you kind of want to, kind of package all this together. But like we've talked about a lot of the idea of sort of how to build yourself up, whether it is on the departmental level, institutional level, wherever you're at, to be a more transformative leader and why that's important. But just your advice and maybe resources, whatever else, like how can leaders better nurture these necessary skills to be a more transformative leader?
Yeah. So I think the first thing all of this we've talked about, remember that the inner work is the most important work. And I think busy leaders with a lot of pressure often feel like I will serve others and I'll put myself last. And that is not sustainable. And you end up being reactive and lashing out and making poor decisions and not having time to think. You've got to find ways to do the inner work. It's absolutely critical. And that's different things for all of us. That's where I spend my time at least at the beginning, right? If we can get really good foundations about who we are and as leaders and what we want to do and what we want to accomplish in the world, handling our inner critic, finding our core values and our life purpose, those things, and returning to them as practices, it can be really great. I do want to sort of answer this question by sharing 7 practices for empowering better tomorrows. And we've talked about every single one of them already. So this is a nice recap, right? It's also chunkable. And if you like lists like me as a way to remember things, and they're super short, they're just 2 words. So the first one is accept reality. And we absolutely talked about that. Don't argue with reality. What's going on? What are the challenges? Accepting reality. The second one is cultivate hope. And we talked about that, right? How could tomorrow be better? What role can I play? And cultivating that, not waiting to feel that or think that, but discovering, finding it, looking for it. The third one is imagining possibilities. What could AI look for our institution? What could the next realm of social media look like for our students? What could a smaller enrolled institution look like that could still be thriving and incredible? And then the fourth one is claim agency. What can I do about this? There's all sorts of things going on in the world that trouble me that I think should be different. And nobody cares what I think. So I could spend my time there, but it's actually wasted energy. So here I get to have a conversation about transformative leadership and higher education, where I actually get to make a difference as a realm of expertise. I work with this. I work with leaders. I work with teams. I do this. So where's the place that I can make a difference? And for some folks, it might be writing an op-ed to the New York Times. I think that's wonderful. They're not going to publish mine because I'm nobody, according to them. But I can parent my children. I can work with teams who are trying to find ways to focus on access and belonging despite the challenges. So where's the agency? What's the role that you can play? The fifth one is embracing responsibility and taking responsibility for what you're going to do and how you're going to do it and how you're going to move forward. I think so many of us see people in our lives who are allergic to responsibility of any kind. And transformative leaders really embrace that responsibility. The sixth one is take action, do something, right? If it's all in your head, if it's all in theory, if it's all conversations on a podcast, if it's all, writing in your notes and you're not actually doing something with how you teach the class or how you lead the next meeting or what you put in the next communication that goes out to everybody, it's taking action. And then the seventh one is reflection for learning. Now that I've accepted the reality and cultivated hope and imagined possibilities and focused on where I can make a difference and I've taken responsibility, I've taken action, how did that go? And should have done it sooner or later or done it this way, or it was great, but I should have included these folks and I didn't. And then that what Brazilian educator Paulo Freire talks about praxis as doing and reflection. And I think we often mistake that as a 2-part process when it is an ongoing cycle. Do it, reflect and learn, do it better. Reflect and learn, see if you can do it better. Reflect and learn, see if you can do it in a different context. Reflect and learn and see if we do it that way. And when leaders are comfortable doing their best, seeing what mistakes they make, being nimble and flexible and making adjustments, who are not tied to perfection and being right, but willing to change their mind and admit mistakes and really tackle things and include others' wisdom and intelligence and ideas that they don't have. And none of us has all the answers. Then you create cultures where everyone's contributing, everyone's inviting, everyone's learning, everyone's growing, everybody's trying to be a part of the solution. And just think, if you had the institution that you're most familiar with, what if everyone was engaged in their different ways of solving the problems there? That would be incredible and amazing things would happen. But too often we're in competition with each other rather than collaborating with each other and bringing that together. And I think transformational leaders are innovative and creative about how they do that and how they move these things forward.
Yeah, this is great stuff. And I think just the focus on the inner work and there's 7 clear sort of strategies. And hopefully people are like jotting down notes, but I mean, we'll certainly have ways to connect with you and all the stuff we've talked about in the show notes and description for this episode, and folks can kind of keep the conversation going. But I think it is that idea of like, for us, where we might be focusing on like specific aspects of like digital transformation of like student experience and engagement or like curriculum or this, that, the other thing. It's like all of this AI would be an area where you could apply like, okay, how are we
utilizing that technology or not? Like, how are we building our policy around that, and how are we articulating that to people? How are we reforming that over time? Like, this could be like, that could be an area where you're putting this into a process, into practice. And, so it's like sort of ending here, I guess, is interesting, that idea of like not being, I guess, entirely clear where the conversation is going to go, but like knowing the idea of like, we're going to hopefully start to equip people with a little bit more of kind of the recipe of, how to be more transformative as a leader. And then whether AI or whatever else was sort of like accelerating that process or sort of a part of it or holding it back, whatever. But like, I wasn't sure how that was going to factor in, but I kind of love where we ended. I love how you kind of brought everything together, and just really appreciate you and all the work that you do, and just everything you're kind of advocating for. And again, I really hope folks will connect with you and all that you work on, and listen to Student Affairs Now and all that good stuff. So just really appreciate you taking the time out for this episode and sharing all that you did.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think this has been a great conversation, super energizing. If folks want to connect, keithedwards.com is the best place to do that. And we'll get a bunch of other things that we can share with you in the show notes for folks who want to do it.
The Hired Geek Podcast is a part of the Enrollify podcast network. If you like this podcast, chances you'll like all the other Enrollify shows too. Our podcast network is growing constantly, and we've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks, all designed to empower you to be a better hired professional. Our shows help you find your next big idea and feature a selection of the industry's best as your host. Learn from people like Jamie Hunt, Seth Odell, Day Kibbles, and Eddie Francis, as well as so many other of your favorite leaders in higher education. Enrollify is made possible by the support of Element 451, a leading AI-powered, all-in-one student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful, personalized, engaging interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.